Inequities with Professor Saskia Sassen and architect Mukta Naik. Rohit is a student of cities and contemporary urbanization, more specifically, the dynamics of emerging urbanization and housing context in India's small cities, its corridor urbanization and climate adaptation practices. He studies these aspects of India's contemporary urbanization in the course of teaching at the School of Environment and Architecture in Mumbai. Welcome, Rohit, and over to you.
Thanks, Meenakshi. It's my pleasure to be in conversation on this panel. Thank you to you and all your colleagues for extending me this invitation to be in conversation with the speakers, the audience, and all of you. Before I kind of invite the speakers, let me kind of talk a little bit about this panel. And I was just wondering, as I was going to introduce this panel, the note that you all have framed, and I was thinking about the note, and what came to my mind, what comes across very sharply is that framings of collapse and fixing that sketch extreme ends of the future have always held a special place in urban imaginations everywhere, and more so in the global south, and especially amongst those engaged in the fields of design and planning. They become particularly important when, as your symposium poses the question, to explore ecologies of adaptation beyond such dualistic framings. Now, in this panel, magnitudes of displacement and inequities, it becomes very important to consider these in more nuanced ways as one kind of looks through or the long-standing structural drivers of socioeconomic inequities, such as precarious and adverse working conditions, economic disparities, anti-democratic political processes and institutions, which are interlinked with identity. In the current times that we are in, from lost livelihoods, greatest digital divides, forced migration due to disruption of employment conditions resulting in displacement and homelessness, exclusion, segregation. The current catastrophe has exacerbated the existing social vulnerabilities in society and it amplified its impacts. How have we managed this divide? What have our recovery practices been? How do our knowledge systems, responses, and outcomes respond to the perpetual pauses? What does it mean to think about agency of those marginalized and displaced? What does normal mean in a world of inequities? These are the questions that this panel might open up. So in opening out a discussion on some of these aspects, we have with us Dr. Saskia Sassen and Professor Mukta Naik. Welcome to both of you. It is my pleasure to be in conversation with both of you. Saskia Sassen is the Robert S. Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia University and a member of its Committee on Global Thought, which she chaired from 2009 to 2015. She's a student of cities, immigration, and states in the world economy, with inequality, gendering, and digitization being the three key variables, the analytical variables that run through her work. Her seminal work on the mobility of labor and capital, especially across transnational territories, and the consequent partialities requires a little introduction. She's currently engaged in a new project on thinking about what an ethics of the city would actually consist of in the face of inequalities and indifference. She's the author of 8 books and the editor or co-editor of 3 books. Together, her authored books are translated in over 20 languages. Her body of work has received many awards and honors, amongst them 12 doctor honoris causa, multiple named lectures, the 2013 Principe Austria's Prize in the Social Sciences, election as a foreign member of the Royal Academy of the Sciences of the Netherlands, and she's been made the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et Lettres by the French government. Pardon me for my pronunciation. It's like,
I love it. I love it. It's so good when we make a bit of fun of the French, just a bit.
that just goes over my head. Welcome, Saskia. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you after having read your work and being a student of your work for a long, long time.
Oh.
Professor Mukta Naik is an architect and urban planner, currently a fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. Her research interests include housing and urban poverty, urban informality and internal migration, as well as urban transformations in small cities. Prior to joining the Center for Policy Research, she worked with Microhome Solutions on a number of community-based interventions to improve housing in informal settlements. Mukta has written widely in the print and digital media and has also run a market research and media services company. She's a graduate of the School of Planning and Architecture and has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Texas A&M University. She's currently pursuing a PhD in urban development and governance from the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies, Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Welcome, Mukta. It's a pleasure to get to know you and hear about your work. I'm so glad to have heard from you day before yesterday and to kind of share notes on what you've been thinking about and the similarities about the things that we both seem to be looking at. So welcome both of you. And with that introduction, I'll first invite Saskia Sassen to make her presentation, followed by Mukta Naik.
Well, it's wonderful for me to have this opportunity to talk with you. I have long admired the type of intelligence that gets generated in your country, because it is a different mode of intelligence. And I have gained a lot from that. As we know, there are many different ways in which we can deploy intelligent systems, intelligent operations, intelligent notions, etc., etc. So for me, India has always been a country that is marked by multiple problematic conditions, but also by an extraordinary kind of knowledge zone. You know, that is a bit your own zone, but it really expands over a domain that much of the typical, let's say, American literature might not. So I really, for me, it's a great pleasure. I am not very often in your country, so it's a great pleasure for me to be here. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about this whole question of displacements and inequities. There are two really growing ascendant elements just about everywhere in the world. It is almost as if once the hegemonic powers of, let's say, for instance, the post-World War II era, what came after that, like when those hegemons were in place, they had the power to command and the power to say no to certain options. Today, one really has a sense that that's weaker and weaker, that we have a multiplying of, oh, I just have a plane going over. I don't know if you hear all that noise. That's not me, that's a plane. But anyhow, there is a sense of something foundational changing. And so one question I have is, in complex systems, how do we know when a new epoch has emerged? And that's a bit my argument. Because one thing is, in simpler worlds, in simpler times, I mean, there was nothing time one, and then time two, they built a big whatever. Nowadays, we don't have that self-evident. You know, there are other mechanisms in play. So one trajectory that I have tracked to address some of these issues is the magnitude of displacements and of inequities. It's not just displacing. It is also producing, generating, if you want, really sharp inequities, in truly unequal elements. Secondly, we have the question of inequality, sure, but also exclusions and expulsions that are more and more able to conduct themselves as if this were legitimate. Whereas I would think that in the post-World War II era, now I'm thinking much about the West, there was a period after World War II and World War I when there was more of a consensus and a respect for each other and a sense we cannot do these wars. I'm talking about World War II, right? These wars again. Well, today, my sense is that we've totally lost any sort of notion about that. Oh, we can't do that, we can. No. So something has changed. Now, one image that immediately comes to my mind is the role of the hegemon. Right now, we have multiple hegemons. We don't have one or the major hegemon. Like after World War II, we had hegemonic powers that had the courage, besides the power, to actually say, all right, this we're not going to do again, and that is all after World War II. And today, so one big question that I have, and I don't have an answer, by the way, but it's just one of the questions that I'm pursuing, is this question of the absence of hegemons. It's like a mess out there. And every now and then somebody surges, another one sinks, etc., etc. But you do not have that other mode. Now, it's not that I am enamored with that other mode. I'm not. I mean, hegemons can be truly problematic. But it just strikes me that when it comes to the poorer and the less powerful, the hegemon can play a role. They don't always do, but they can play a role. In today's world, it's quite different. And one image that I have is a kind of disassembling of a variety of modes of interaction. And where that disassembling of existing modalities, of existing connections, of existing options, as that declines more and more, the question for me becomes, what is next? What can rise against this, transversality that seems endless, where multiple differences can be, tried out, commanded, etc., etc. So that is sort of one of the points. Second point, a country like the United States. Now, you may know that I'm Dutch and that I really grew up in Latin America. So, I also have that angle. So when I speak about the United States, I also have a kind of a South American element in play there. Huh? So for me, the United States, very generous, be a professor and all of that. Oh, good. I'm not criticizing that. I don't want to talk about it either. We all know that that's the most reasonable part, I think, that the United States has managed to produce. But a lot of Americans are simply protected, because they are not necessarily inclined to study the world, right? They're literally protected from much of the violence that is rising in the United States, but also in the world. It's like it's really, and I'm talking about people who are not stupid, I'm talking people who are intelligent and who spend hours and hours studying certain texts that they need, for their dissertations or for their careers, whatever. So there is a strong knowledge zone, innovation zone in the United States, no doubt. But there also is this other mode. Now, is it because it's such a big country? But your country is very big too, right? I mean, I have a problem with big countries. I always say that the Netherlands, very little country, actually, where I was born, has done very well for itself, precisely because it is smallish. You can sort of manage and control it, for good or for bad, by the way. So in the United States, again, what I see is sort of that people seem protected from much of the violence that rises in the world. Now, the United States is a huge country. If you go to the vast interior of that country, as opposed to the New York cities and the, whatever, San Francisco places that way. But the level of ignorance of professors, of dentists, of cleaners, of whatever, you mention it, the smartest to the not so smart. But the level of ignorance, it's like almost a willful not knowing what all is happening in the world and in your own country. You stick sort of with the familiar, with what is comfortable, and everybody's happy. Now, happiness is a very, how shall I put it, not particularly effective item in the world of Americans, in the lives of Americans, but that's another matter. Now, but the point that I want to capture here is the extent to which people in rich countries, you can also say that for the Netherlands, you can say that for Germany, the question really is, are people really protected in these rich countries from the violence that rises not only in the world, but inside their own countries? And so this would be a second issue for me. What is it that might be in your face, but we are certain elements that we do not see? And so part of that is what I just described. I hope that that was clear. In other words, that there are forms of violence that if we just visit there for 6 months or whatever, we would not pick up on. But they're there because I've spent more time in some of these, right? And it's a violence that is not, they don't kill, they don't use guns. It's another kind of violence. I have the impression that you in your caste system can also enable those kinds of violence that present themselves as, it's okay, it works, blah, blah. And I just, this is a subject that I would love to hear you addressed, you explained to me a bit better. How does that work? I mean, we all know the extremes of India, but they are probably reducing now. So the question is that which really will not go away anytime soon, the inequalities, the notions, etc. All our countries have that. In the case of India, it's just a grander project because it is so much connected to the caste system, to religious issues. So it would be for me very interesting to add to my knowledge a bit. Now, a third point for me is the whole question of the technologies. I'm not interested in sort of the grandest, the most intelligent, the most technology. I'm not. But technology can play an extraordinary role. We now know that, and certainly your country is a very good example of that, where poor people can actually benefit from the technology. Not as much as rich people will benefit from it, but they can benefit from it. They have a tool, an added tool to their small basket of tools that they can now deploy. And so for me, it's extraordinarily important to enable access. Now, in the United States, everything is about money. So you have in low-income neighborhoods, in an advanced city like New York, Chicago, etc., you have people who are still working off the phone to communicate with others. You know that there was an in-between system that was very elementary when it first came out, and that to me is obscene. That is not only cruel, unacceptable, it's also obscene and it's shameful. And I wanted to ask, and this is one aspect of your country that I am not familiar with, I must say, but I wonder if there also is that sense of how is this possible? Because you with your caste system have enabled also inequities, not that the caste system per se has to be that, but it enables those who don't care about being brutal, let's put it that way, right? And then further on this technological aspect, technology is everywhere. And I would just be very interested in hearing, even very briefly from you, what's happening with technology? How are the new generations reacting? Is it just only what we all read about, that they are then connected to others and I don't know what all? Are there other systematicities that run through the technological. And you, of course, have innovated a lot. You have invented, India has known how to use the new technologies in brilliant ways, because you have your original, you have a sort of, like the Dutch are a bit that way too, that you have a different way of doing it, say, from the mainstream. Certainly for me, in the case of the United States, this is what I think of as the mainstream. Now, agency, the agency that the displaced have. This is a subject that is important. This is a subject that is still a very little subject when all is said and done. It's not like we have done a lot of innovations around that kind of stuff. And so with your caste system, I mean, I am sometimes really horrified at some of the presumptions of higher caste people vis-a-vis lower caste people. I would just love to hear a bit from you, all smart, intelligent, probably very, very sort of oriented towards social justice, etc. What are we seeing in India today? How is that changing? I have not been in India, I think, for 2 years now. And the last time I was there, it was very brief, so I really didn't. And then the final point, which is a bit of a provocation, if you want, and that is, how do we actually fully capture the agency that the displaced have? They have agency, but we frankly don't even have a name for it, right? We don't really. Maybe in your language you have, but in English, not really. The displaced, the poor, I mean, it's always sort of a certain zone. So sort of one wrap up set of images, 2 images here: cultures of the displaced and magnitudes of displacement, which is 2 different vectors in terms of how to think of this, how to address it, how to study it, how to name it. Shall I just stop and then we can enter conversation and we can add, or is the plan a bit different?
The plan, Saskia, was that you give your talk followed by Mukta, and then we'll get into a conversation. We have an hour following that.
Okay, very, very good. So I have about what, half an hour, I guess, right? It's yeah, exactly. Okay, then let me get at some of the kinds of changes that we could execute, the kind of innovations that could really make a difference. I think that is one subject that I'm very interested in. Now, again, it must be recognized that the United States has been particularly indifferent to enabling the poorer classes to enter the technological. I think your country probably has done much better, but you correct me. I would really like to know that. We can return to that later. The United States is really neither here nor there when it comes to what do we do with the lower income classes. They just leave them to their own, and I've rarely seen a municipal government, that there have been a few, but it's rare, that actually go out of their way to enable the poor. Whereas I grew up in Argentina, in Latin America. There you had often people, actors, who were very keen on enabling the poor when a new innovation appeared. I cannot say, I mean, there are some people, of course, and partly because they love the technology and so they want to spread it out, but that's just one modality that is not going to help the masses of those who have little access to good tech. So that is something I think that really needs to be addressed in a country like the United States, where you have so much rich, etc. So let me then add to what I have already said, this whole question of displacement. Because I don't know about your countries, but displacement is a very radical negative intervention that is growing and growing. As the concentrations of people in cities grow, you also have a very strong reaction, and I would love to hear about your countries, to push them out, to make them disappear. Not killing them necessarily, because that is more problematic, I guess, but making them disappear, out of the way, out of the way. In the United States, sometimes with a brutality that is extraordinary, that is shameful, that is, which leaves people on the street. Now, I know that in some of your cities, you have a lot of people living on the street. Well, we in the United States, in New York and on the East Coast, on the other coast, the West Coast, also are doing that, right? So the fact that we humans, we share our humanity, that we have gotten to that, to me, is a very, very serious issue. In my reading, it's not going to change anytime soon. It's going to grow. This is not an easy issue to track, because it's often little conditions, little elements, etc. But by God, we must address it. Let me add a bit more to the question of the agency of the displaced, which is a subject now fairly dear to my heart, though it is also, it has horrible elements. But how is it possible that in a rich city like New York, like so many rich cities in the United States, I'm just going to talk about the United States, that there is an extraordinary indifference, and we see them on the street. I mean, some of you must have seen the images of on the West Coast, of people who are, maybe 50 years old, women, etc., who are living at the edges of the city in these, these entities, sort of, you can even call it a house. I mean, it's just a piece of tarpaulin that they have in order to protect themselves from the rain. That in a city that is extraordinarily rich, both sides of the continent that is the United States. What has happened to our sense of solidarity is a great word, but it's also a bit of an ambiguous word. But how do we? And I notice it even in myself. I'm horrified, but then I walk on, because you don't want to stand there and, so is the walking away so that we don't offend them, is that all we can do? I feel sometimes, my God, that's all we can do. That's all we're doing. And then you go back to so many micro histories that contain within them this option of a quick exit from that, which is truly frightening, horrifying, totally sad. We walk away. We have the option to walk away. And we mostly, frankly, do, either because we're too busy, because the students are waiting in the classroom, so you have to go. I mean, there are good and bad reasons. And so the question then for me is, what are the elements, the constitutive elements in our ways of thinking that have changed from, let's say, from 30 years ago? Now, 30, 40 years ago, we were coming out of a big war, right? There were multiple, so there was a spirit of generosity, a spirit of helping, because we had exited a big war. Today, that is not quite the case in many of we have a lot of little wars, but not these massive wars like World War II. And ultimately, when you see too many people sleeping on the street, we're humans. We really have limits. And one of the limits is that we see it and we walk on, because we must, because somebody's waiting, or because we don't know how to handle it. Now, I want to stick on we don't know how to handle it. That to me is right now a big challenge. I frankly, when I think, how can I help? I have the most elementary conditions in play, which are not going to go very far, which is at least water, food, shelter, etc. Right? I mean, if I can bring, and this is happening in our cities, at least in the United States, especially on the two coasts, that people just bring regularly, every day, whatever, something. to those poor who are basically sitting on the street or sleeping at night below the benches. I mean, something has to give. We can't go on that way. We who are trying to help can go on that way, and certainly those who are suffering can go on. And is it that we have too many people in the world? Is this the way we're going to get rid of people so that we have more space? And so one issue that I am now working on, fighting for, etc., is we need to build more cities. We need medium-sized cities all over the place. We cannot allow what is happening, which is the big enterprises, the rich, etc. They don't even notice that the workers that they need have to travel often an hour and a half or two, arrive dead tired at their jobs, Hence, often there are accidents because they fall asleep. I mean, it's just not on. How is it possible that with the wealth that we have, with the options that we have, with also in the United States, the vast amount of land that we have, we should be building medium-sized cities all over the place? I'm totally against now these vast, vast cities that benefit the rich, but the poor, they forget how many hours the poor have to travel to get there. So the issue for me then is, how do we create a new logic that has to do with medium-sized cities? The medium-sized city allows the worker not to have to get up 2 hours earlier, etc., dead tired every day, etc. No. And what's the big deal of building a whole bunch of medium-sized cities? We can do it. Instead, in a country like the United States, not in a country like the Netherlands, for instance, I mean, they do it the right way, I must say, but not the Americans, they really don't. And so how do we manage to generate a new logic that says, we are going to expand, yes, but we're going to do it via the construction of new cities, getting out of the notion that there's only one great city or two great cities where you must be. Hell no, it's not true. Now, you know that some of these very fancy, very, very fancy American high-tech operations have moved to areas which are a bit remote. We don't know exactly how it is going, but they left San Francisco and they went to a place which was a small city. You need a city, but a small city. And so that is, to me, also a sort of an interesting question. I'm hoping that we get the data soon. How is that going? So they took some major operations out of the East Coast, the North, and they took them to a fairly smallish area. There was not much housing. I think that is sort of interesting. It's not ideal, but it is interesting, and I'm sort of curious. I'm trying to track it to see where it goes. Now, I wanted to start wrapping up with this whole notion of the magnitude of displacements of people, of entities, of modest businesses. There is a lot of displacement happening, and I think your country also has experienced that, if I am right. But certainly the United States, there is a lot of that. And what is displacement? That's also interesting language. It's mostly not used in these settings. It's used well, whatever the language. But the question of being displaced, historically speaking, certainly after World War II, this was a term that we associated with wars, with people who survived, etc., etc. Today, when we say displacement in the West, maybe not in your country, guess what is the main meaning? The main meaning is people thrown out of their homes. That's the meaning today. And so this question, I just use this as an example of how language is also playing here. And one has to actually become, in some cases, aware that a term that you knew as, it means A, B, actually now is also meaning B and C. We have accepted, certainly in the United States, I don't know in your country, we have accepted that there are going to be more and more people sleeping on the street or brought into, some whatever entities that protect them. And, there is New York City, chic city, rich city. The world is interested in it. And then there are all these people who don't have a home. Same thing in San Francisco. The richest cities in the United States are also the destination of those without housing. Now, the positive reading is, positive in quotation marks, it's a very relative positive. The positive reading is, well, because it's a big city, because these are people who are used to all kinds of conditions. I mean, the people who live there, who have houses, because they travel across the world, because they are so busy with their big enterprises. They are also sort of the kindest because, okay, fine, we'll give them a bit of money with it. But that's no way of solving the problem. I'm very grateful that those people do that, but that's not the way to solve it. And so we then develop what we have done, certainly in the Americas, is we have developed practices that aim at enabling, but it is a kind of enablement that is temporary and that does not get them very far. In other words, you feed them, you give them a bit of a room, a space, and then what? So that is not the way to do it. Now, what is the way to do it is another question. That's not the subject here, but it is a challenge. It is a challenge, and the growth of a kind of indifference that we see is very problematic. Now, I'm going to stop talking. I would love to hear what, at the level of the issues that I raised for the Americas, how does that play out, or not at all, or in a very different way in your countries? We'd really like to gain some knowledge from you. How's that? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Saskia. And a number of provocations over there, and I'll just kind of, before handing it over to Mukta, the provocation on small cities that you made over here is kind of very interesting. Small cities in India have been kind of thought of as inward-looking enclaves of local economy, politics, and culture. And over the last decade, there has been a growing realization that these are the places, as against the port-based colonial cities that were set up, or Delhi, which was the capital that was set up by the people,
right,
which are taking over. So thanks for that provocation. I'll invite Mukta to come in, and then we can following her talk, we can have fun.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rohit, and thank you, Saskia, for those provocations. I am going to be a little bit more conventional and sort of empirical in my presentation today, but I think I study migrants and migration and mobilities within the Indian context, and I'm going to speak sort of in the wake of what we saw during COVID, and again, the word displacement is not the word that was used for what we saw when the migrants walked home from places of employment as soon as India had its lockdown in March 2020. We didn't call it displacement. We called it exodus. We called it fleeing the city. We used a whole bunch of other terms. But I'm basically in my talk trying to embed that shock mobility in a larger understanding of how people are constantly moving to survive, essentially, in the Indian context, and how those so migration for me is a lens from which to look at a whole bunch of other problems. I'm an urbanist too, so the city is very much a frame of reference for what I do. My PhD work is on small cities and migration. So yes, I've also been thinking a lot about what happens when rural youths go to not Bombay, not Delhi, but to a smaller place where there's maybe just one industry town. How is that person's experience different from the experience that we've read in so many books and watched in movies of the Bombay slum, or, so there are these caricaturized experiences of poverty that we are constantly seeing, and we start believing in them, which sort of relates, Saskia, to your first point about what we see on the surface is the impression that we carry. And even if we are educated, how much do we really know about the world around us? And, how much do we think and engage with even our immediate communities, leave alone, the world across? So I'd request to have my presentation on. It has a few pictures and some sort of words on the screen that might help people maybe better understand what I'm talking about. So could that be brought on board, please?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Varun, will you be sharing?
Yeah, while it's going on, I can continue. So essentially, if you could go to slide, yeah, this is a good slide, and make it full screen, please. Yeah. So essentially, India is actually a really, second slide, is a very mobile sort of an economy. So the census already says a third of India's population are internal migrants. The migrants are really crucial to the various economic sectors. But the census doesn't count very well these 150 million footloose laborers who walk, who sort of move from city to city, or even from one village to another for agricultural labor. So this is not necessarily rural, urban, long distance migration. It largely constitutes short distance movement, simply because they don't have enough work, they don't own enough land for it to be productive enough to feed them. So this is very poor, very subsistence level work, stuff that we are talking about. And then there is a lot of commuting. So what urbanization, especially urbanization along transportation and infrastructure corridors, has done, we've built all these rural highways, we've connected the whole city country with these roads, 4-lane, 8-lane highways. And what it's really created is a lot of commuting. So cities, especially those medium-sized cities, Saskia, that you were talking about, are actually very dependent on commuting labor, which is coming in from even smaller cities or rural areas which are within a 2-hour radius of it. So your point about people actually commuting long hours on a daily basis in order just to get remunerative work really resonates in the Indian context right now. And it's also important to remember that India's we have many grades and many sort of different types of densities. So you could be classified rural in terms of your governance categorization, but your densities could resemble small town America or be as dense as a city in the US in terms of how close people are packed in together into a city. So there are these sort of peculiarities of Indian urbanization that we need to keep in mind when we think about people moving in order to look for work. We're also at a moment in India when the economy has not been able to create many productive jobs. In fact, today morning, there's a very nice feature, it's in the Sunday newspapers, about millennials in India, and a lot of alarming data about how few people have secure remunerative jobs. They're scrambling, they're doing multiple work just to sort of survive and contribute to their household incomes. Again, resonates with the debates in the West at this time with the gig economy and with technology creating low value, low paid kind of, not very secure jobs. Next, please. That's just the context I wanted to set. So essentially, the story here is that on 25th March last year, India goes into a national lockdown, and there's a crisis of hunger because there's a whole bunch of poor people who need to get out of their homes and work every day so that they get money at the end of the day to buy their food. It is literally, that is their life, and they now don't have that source of income anymore. And so they start moving out of the city to their villages. All of us who are from India, of course, don't need me to tell you this story. This was a heart-wrenching a media story that unfolded across India and also got a lot of global attention. Interestingly, I'm also doing some work on looking at how the elite actually looked at this and what kind of did it create this moment of empathy and altruism at that, and did that altruism actually sustain beyond those first few weeks? To speak to Saskia's points about, do you just walk by or walk past poverty? Now, this was a moment where people could not ignore what was happening. It was heart-wrenching, and it did affect a lot of people beyond the people who were actually displaced. So the Indian government's attitude in the initial days was their entire focus was on maintaining the lockdown. So they have a National Disaster Management Act in place, and they're seeing this as a public health issue. And so containing people is paramount. And so all the focus is on containing people, and the subnational governments are told keep them wherever they are. If you have to provide shelter or food or do whatever you need. So you have stadia being converted, all sorts of other government infrastructure, schools being converted into places where these fleeing migrants can somehow be fed and held and be prevented from walking across or sort of running across the countryside, in their imagination, I suppose, at that time, spreading COVID. But people leave anyway. And there's a lot of debate about how much of this is vulnerability and how much of this is sort of more like the Scots agency stuff where, migrants are saying, I don't really care what you want me to do, I'm going to go home anyway. So it was this sort of a strange moment. And then about a month after this crisis had started, and it really blew out of proportion, that the government actually started buses and trains to move people home. And now we know from the data that a month in, when there were a lot of infections in the kind of informal settlements that these migrants were living in, it was this delay in taking the migrants home that actually carried COVID into smaller towns and villages. So it's ironical in the sense that, the entire purpose of the lockdown and the first few weeks of wasting time in transporting people home actually resulted in a spread of the disease to places that otherwise may not have had that many infections. Next, please. Just a few pictures. This is a picture from a shelter just outside a homeless shelter in Delhi. And so the daily wage labor, actually, this picture was taken on the 26th or 27th of March, literally 2 days since after the lockdown was announced. And this is laborers from across the city walking to shelters where the Delhi government is providing free food. So they needed to be fed, so they're here. And there were lines all day to eat. Next, please. This is the kind of surveillance, and this sort of links to, Saskia, your point on data and on technologies, and on the flip side of using technology to disperse social welfare and a whole bunch of good stuff that you can do with technology. And the other side of it, of course, is the fact that technologies also get used a lot for surveillance. In this case, of course, in this picture, we're just talking about how there was a higher police presence in informal settlements to ensure that people were disciplined when they were standing in line for food, and they minimized their sort of wandering outside of the house so that the lockdown was not violated. Next, please. Next is a picture of the kind of visuals we saw during those weeks. Next. And here, here's the world was talking about social distancing, and this was the kind of desperation to get back home. So it was really ironical, and you can see that the mask usage is not very great. People want to go home, and why do they want to go home? What's this great need to go home? Next. So so essentially, just to speak to the themes of what we the abstract, the brief that was given to us today, what did we learn from this? First is that poverty, mobility, inequality, they've actually been normalized and invisibilized in Indian society. So all these people coming out of wherever they lived and wherever they worked and walking on the streets suddenly showed a whole bunch of people who were conveniently not thinking about them that they're there. So there was this visibility that migrants got that they hadn't got before. We know from all the data that's been put out in this last 1 year that the pandemic has only increased inequalities, economic inequalities in Indian societies. And we also know, like Saskia already mentioned, that economic inequality in Indian society relates very closely to social identity like caste, religion, and so on, and gender too. So those three axes are what I think of in my work as important axes to always consider when you're asking yourself questions about inequality. You need to immediately think about caste, religion, and gender as sort of is the phenomenon that I'm seeing relating to these three at the very least, if not other variables. And we know that we want inclusionary and sustainable pathways to recovery, but we don't know what those might be at this point of time. The government's sort of way of looking at this, and understandably, is to expand the social security and social welfare net as much as possible to help the poor tide over this sort of period. But I would argue, and this is something that I've been arguing a lot in my work, is that only considering the poor or the displaced or the underprivileged as beneficiaries of state largesse is not a sustainable way to look at them, because then you completely discount the agency that they might have in being able to improve their lives. So you need to ask also side-by-side questions of how do you create, if you're intervening in housing, it's not just about giving them a roof over their heads, it's about creating assets that can have intergenerational positive effects. Similar, and so I'm using housing as an example, and so on and so forth for everything that you do. I work in a policy institution, so I'm going to keep jumping to government policy as sort of my use case for everything that I'm saying, but you get the gist. I mean, people who are working in design should definitely be able to apply similar logics. If you're designing something, people who are working, as planners, the same, and so on and so forth. Next, please. So, I mean, I'll go quickly over the next few slides, but I think they might interest Saskia because her questions about caste and, how these sort of systemic social inequalities actually factor into questions of displacement might, be a little elaborated here. So essentially, I've been corresponding with Dr. Piao Zhang, who is, who's been proposing this concept of shock mobilities as sort of a way to try and think through what's been happening during the pandemic. But what's interesting is that these shock mobilities actually have long afterlives. So there's a shock, and then there's a series of aftershocks. And these also relate to whatever forms of mobility already existed before the shock came. So if we consider the pandemic as that sort of point of shock, what did we see between April 2020 and April 2021? So I'm using that sort of those empirical vignettes that I got through my own fieldwork, telephonic interviews, following a few migrant families who were already respondents in my work before, but checking in with them periodically through the 12-month period to see what they were doing, hearing a lot from bureaucrats and NGOs and civil society workers in 5 different states in the country, with 3 of whom are sort of poor states which send out a lot of migrants, and 2 of them receiving states that get in a lot of migrants from other states. So I'm talking about, for the Indian audience, Chhattisgarh, Uttar Pradesh, Odisha, which are the poorer states, and Gujarat and Maharashtra, which are the richer states. So we basically did over 70 interviews with civil society and bureaucrats, so government officials in these 5 states, to understand what was happening with migrants and how policy was sort of responding to them. And this is what we found. Next slide, please. So what constituted shock? What acted as the trigger? And this is where, displacement and its complexity comes into the picture. So at that moment, the push out of the city was, of course, loss of livelihood, rising debt. A lot of it was housing insecurity. Actually, fear of COVID was the least cited reason in all of our work. The loss of livelihood, rising debt, and housing insecurity were the top reasons, and in these 2 in very complex forms. For instance, and elaborate later, housing insecurity was not just evictions, it was also because people lived in the workplace. So when the workplace was shuttered, they simply didn't have anywhere to live. So it was as simple as that, But there were also pull factors. Back at home, there were safety nets for survival. You could access state benefits because your identities were tagged to your rural home locations, which you didn't access in the city. So that essential failure of the state to make benefits portable has become a big policy conversation in India right now. And in that sense, COVID has been a blessing, because for those of us who are migration scholars have been shouting ourselves hoarse for the last 15 years about this, suddenly we're getting a lot of attention, and there is actually a lot of technology and non-technological initiatives to try and resolve that particular issue. And then there were those affective sort of reasons. Home represents safety to people. There are people at home, old people, parents, grandparents, who need to be taken care of. And if I'm stuck in the city in a lockdown, what's going to happen to my people back home? And I'm bringing this up because I think it's important to understand that people take rational decisions sometimes because of affective and emotional reasons, and that's not something that a very economist policy discourse considers, and it should. So, I mean, we don't know how to measure this, and so we don't consider it, but it's something that did come out a lot in this experience. Next, please. So I'll give, this is what I was mentioning, that home was not always security. So, you live in all these insecure situations in the city. Obviously, if the city becomes difficult, you want to run away and go home. Even though the village is conceptualized in India as a place rife with caste-based inequality and discriminatory experiences, it is still a refuge and home and belonging. So this is the strange sort of tension in that idea of the village as home and village as security, whereas all the literature on caste in India actually conceptualizes the city as a space of emancipation and the village as a place of discrimination. So, and this is what urbanists are struggling with a lot, because the city has not been that space of emancipation because of the way labor practices have actually limited people with socially disadvantaged identity to very specific types of work, to very specific types of contractual sort of modes of getting that work. So there is a lot of limitation to what an SC or a Dalit can do and negotiate in a city, and that's something that we do need to take on board. Next, please. There are a few vignettes which just illustrates that being visible or invisible in the city actually has consequences for whether you're mobile or not. So invisible spaces that act as home, these have actually hidden the realities of migration. And we actually saw in Chhattisgarh, for instance, we saw that the state was surprised that there were so many women and children returning, because they had this impression that it's only single males who go out to work, only able-bodied men who leave to work, because the women and children were concentrated either working as domestic help inside people's homes, or not visible in the public sphere, or doing brick kiln work or construction work. So basically live clustered inside a work site in a labor camp, and again, not interacting with the public sphere. So you don't see them, so they don't exist. And now you see them, and now you suddenly wake up to the reality that migration is actually a very different animal from what we thought it was. Next, please. I'll skip this if we can go after this. So basically, we saw that people made very considered and strategic mobility choices after that first shock. Do we go back? Do we stay in the village? Do we wait it out? What happens if COVID comes again? And all of this was being talked about and very actively considered. There are a few scenarios which we observed. Next, please. We observed that those who were really from tribal families, from very low caste positions, who worked in industries like brick kilns, construction, cash crop agriculture, and where the labor practices were family-based, like I was mentioning, the entire family goes and works somewhere, and women and children are part of that deal, and it's a very particular form of recruitment, actually experienced immobility because they just got locked into their work sites and didn't go home at all. So they actually went home after they finished their contractual periods. So they were locked into their work sites and working, many of them, especially if the work sites were located in peri-urban, places where the state's machinery the surveillance machinery was not very active. Next. Industrial labor, which is largely constituted by male workers from other backward castes. So these are other backward castes, are sort of the top end of the lower caste. So these are aspirational castes. They actually made multiple trips. These people do industrial work. They do also some service work, which puts them directly in touch with the elites, like being security guards or drivers. So there are, again, very particular work locations in the city. So they did move home, but they kept coming back to the cities to check where, whenever they heard there was a work opportunity. And then if it didn't work out, they went back to the village because they had the capital to do that. They were not the most underprivileged. They had a little bit of capital, a little bit of, a leeway to be able to move back and forth to take advantage of the economy as it was beginning to open back up. But the women stayed behind because they were not working in the city, or their work was not so remunerative, perhaps. So the risk was not being taken by the entire family, but just by the male member of the family coming back. Next. So again, same thing with landless and very marginalized people, the men forayed back. And what was interesting here is the women and children stayed back because they could access subsidized food, and they had homes in the village, relatively secure homes in the village. But also the demand from women for work under India's Rural Livelihood Employment Guarantee Program increased substantively during the COVID period. So basically the state governments got a lot more women coming and asking for that, to avail benefits of that program, because they were not going back with the menfolk to the city immediately. They were waiting it out till the economic recovery was stable enough for them to make that investment in their return to the city. Next. Domestic workers, many of them didn't go back immediately. They thought it would be okay, but then again, when they realized that it was going to be a long haul, when a lot of elites were not comfortable with domestic workers coming into their homes and working because of, again, ideas of purity and pollution that sort of match on to caste identities and class identities. So this was a really confused space where, they were hit very hard by the lockdown, and they had to take these decisions to go home, and they delayed their exit. They also delayed their return back into the city. Next. I'll skip this and move forward. I think just wanted to close because I've been talking for a long time. So I was thinking, I know that a lot of people here in this room today are coming from an architectural practice or design or policy planning practice space. A lot of students were thinking about how all of this that we're talking about could relate to, their future profession as architects and the kind of studios that they're engaging with. So I'm just thinking of a few use cases where all of this would fit in as we reimagine cities post the pandemic. One use case is rental housing. It's been a very flat imagination from this. Formal rental housing in India is a very new conversation. The state has not really intervened very much in rental housing. But as designers, we need to think about what it means for design when you're talking about so many different temporalities of migration, different kinds of payment frequencies for different kinds of labor. So we can't really imagine rental housing where you have a 12-month contract with monthly fixed payments. It doesn't work for the people who need the housing in the city. So what do you do? What does it look like? What are the spaces designed like? Are they single men? Are they families? How long do they need to stay? We need to think about all these realities when we design. The importance of entry and exit spaces. What happens to transport terminals? How do we think about them as spaces of sustenance, as spaces that can integrate people coming in and out with social services and with welfare? How can we reimagine the lives of people who are living at work sites? So there have been studies that show that municipalities don't even give them infrastructure connections, because those sites are only going to have people living on them for a couple of years. And so they don't even get those temporary water or sewer connections. And nobody in the city really bothers, which means that by design, we are consigning people to living substandard lives for a couple of years. And then those people are going to go to another city and another work site, which has similarly substandard conditions. So they are continuously locked into poor living conditions because this has never been on the agenda of people who think about what these kind of spaces should be like, and what infrastructure they would need. And similarly, public space design. I mean, here I think I'd just pick on the securitization sort of thing. There was recently a news article about Delhi being the city in the world that had the largest number of CCTV cameras in public space or something like that. And it's immediately set off like a little bit of a competition between different Indian cities, with different Indian cities saying, oh, we have many too, and we have so many thousand, and that kind of stuff. And we're really thinking of we're very anxious about public space and who meets who in the public space, whether it's gender and young couples and whether they should meet or not meet, or whether it's about the poor and the rich encountering each other in public space. So that sort of colonial notion of the public space as a surveilled space has not gone in 75 years of being an independent country. And again, as designers, how do we think about this? Because this is also where the homeless are spending most of their time and sleeping under the bench. This is also where people who enter and exit the city, like the commuters, and they don't have a home. And if they have to do 2 different jobs in the city, they're probably loitering around here for a few hours between one meeting and the other. So it's important to think about how these spaces actually enable opportunity for those who are displaced and marginalized. I'll close there. I think I have one more slide, the last one. No, it's thank you. Thank you so much.
That was formidable. I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
I was trying to hit some of the points that you brought up just to make it a better conversation after this. Yeah.
Really, yes.
Thanks, Mukta. Thanks, and you did. I mean, kind of get into very lovely conversation with some of the provocations that Saskia posed. And as I kind of, I'm trying to think through some of the intersections between both your talks, one thing that emerges in both your talks that is very important is the question of language. And I think across all disciplines and even within the discipline of architecture, the question of how do we conceptualize through language certain kinds of spaces, practices, processes, politics becomes very important.
Yeah.
And the difference between displacement and exodus, as kind of Mukta opened out, marks a very important framing of language. And I'm kind of wondering over there that in this framing of displacement particularly,
in this what? I missed that. In this what?
In the framing of displacement.
Framing of displacement, yeah.
Framing of displacement with its very nuanced overtones of dispossession, exclusion, and so on, so forth, which have been very important to us. And the world over, but also in India, a lot of work, academic work, but also by activists around questions of dispossession, exclusion, has kind of lent itself very sharply to thinking about policy frames. And the way in which kind of it opens out an avenue for intervention through policy is through the vector of rights, through the analytical framing of rights. And Mukta, in some of the empirical cases that Mukta kind of opened out, particularly around places of work and living, one sees that exclusion or dispossession may not be the necessary or the only way to frame things, because yes, that happens, but when you kind of try to look at through the rights frames, many many urbanists in India have pointed out that the rights frame, which lends itself to housing, thinking about housing,
That's
new
right.
housing particularly, weakens the claims of those who are already setting in through varied practices of work and living in some of these spaces. So this is this kind of, how do we now open this out given the context of the pandemic? This is the question
Yeah.
that I have. How do we now take it forward? Because Mukta kind of, in opening out ideas for ways in which architects can kind of take this further beyond thinking about policy, made very important suggestions is to look at spatialities
Yeah.
of some of these spaces and how they kind of afford certain kinds of practices or not. For instance, in Mukta's kind of work, she pointed out that in large cities, the labor did leave from those cities. So what were those partialities that afforded for certain kinds of practices or not? This becomes, and the language through we conceptualize this becomes a very important way to kind of,
Yeah,
think.
I agree. I agree that the language we use will matter a lot if we want to succeed at this. It's not the language of we help the poor. It has to be much more embedded in a quite diverse set of, where there are people who have some money at least and people who are poor. I mean, and right now I would say also in the West, we don't have the languages that we need in order. I mean, language, I don't mean languages as in different languages, but you know what I mean. We just don't have it. We call it the housing question. That's the most sort of open way of saying it, because you don't give away everything. You say we must. Immediately a whole bunch of people are going to say, okay, I'm out of here. So whereas, but I also, I mean, my take, the argument that I make in the United States, every country is a bit different. So you have a very crowded country. The United States is underpopulated. So of course one thinks, why can't we build some new cities in some of this vast interior that the United States has, where there is nothing happening, which is simply empty land? Now, the center of the United, that internal land is it's pretty tough area in the sense of, it's flat, as you have never seen flat. And people don't like that. People like, a bit of, but I do think that the United States should be exhibit number one in this whole central area, where they have so much unused space. Now it's very difficult. The second point, I think I already alluded to it earlier, is that people, when you say, well, we must build new cities, they look at you like, this, we've done it. There is a strong sense, I don't know in your country, but in the United States or in Latin America, there's a strong sense we have done the building of cities. The notion of starting a new city, let's remember the famous, case from Brazil, which goes into the middle of the country to build, and people said, are you crazy? Well, it has worked out. It hasn't worked out as well, as strongly as was hoped. But to the surprise of many, actually it has worked out. But that was a major project. It took years and years. It involved multiple debates. And it's a tough one. So what I want to communicate here is that how difficult it is. You would think that builders would say, yeah, great, let's go build cities. No, they don't want to. They don't want to go build a city in a new terrain because it's a risk. So it is a peculiar moment. I think that will change eventually. I think the new generations want to live more in smaller towns. We're beginning to see that very strongly in the US. They don't want to be in the big cities. If they begin to do that, and they're young, they are ready to devote time and effort to that, certain smaller cities will begin to emerge. I mean, the Netherlands is a very good example. The Netherlands has a lot of small cities. And, it has worked for all those cities. Those cities are all functional, they are attractive, people like living there, and they are very different types of cities. The north is very cold, the south is a bit less cold, all of that. So there should be a way. And the question that I keep asking myself is, why are we resisting? What is it in us and the connection to place that makes us so rigid about the housing question, And when I tell people in New York, we've got to stop expanding these major cities to an endless domain, endless size, because the travelers, the modest travelers really suffer. I mean, they don't sleep enough, etc. And they look at me like saying, but we've built the cities. Well, no, we need more. But I don't know what your when you speak about building cities in your country, do people actually say, yes, we want that? Is it that way or not? Because I can imagine in your country is very crowded, that people would be delighted at the notion that we're going to build a new city. Or is that not so? In New York, they don't react that way. They are negative on building a new city. But tell me about your country.
Yeah, so Mukta, would you like to take that question up?
Sure. So we, Saskia,
Delhi as well as being in Delhi as well as working on small cities.
India actually is contrary to our own self-perception. We have a lot of cities.
Yeah, you have a lot of cities.
We have cities ranging from 10,000 to, and we also have villages who have 10,000 people. So that's the irony. I mean, the population density or size does not necessarily signify the rurality or the urbanity of a place. What does do that is levels of infrastructure and state sort of investment. And I think that's where we get really caught. We haven't had a very good track record with putting in quality state investment into a place and then raising it to the level of a city.
Right, exactly.
We're just not very confident of doing that. But if I go back to the rural highways program, it basically urbanized the country. But by default, just by creating this route, I mean, so what it tried to do was connect the big cities, but what it ended up doing is basically creating a corridor of urbanity everywhere, but it's a low quality urbanity, Saskia. These are not places which are exciting for young people to go and live in. They go because there's nowhere else to go. So I think it's a little bit more about the quality and especially with this work from home scenario. I mean, a lot of things I think are shifting right now, but it comes down, and that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to talk about is that a lot of people who come to the city don't want to live there permanently. They're engaging with the city as places where employment is currently available. So I think the focus of rearranging your investment practices such that those employment opportunities actually come up in a wider range of places would really help. And that's sort of what some of the projects, I mean, some of the thinking in India has been. So it's not so much about building new cities, but about sort of empowering and investing in some of these tier 2, tier 3 cities, which have the potential to become, more prosperous, more productive, more cosmopolitan spaces. So that's sort of more the idea. I don't think people are resistant to the idea of more cities. I think everyone understands that India is still up on the up curve of urbanization.
So how many new cities are being built, let's say, in these last 10 years?
No new cities are being built. It's just the older ones that are getting denser and large and adding people.
Yeah.
Saskia, India's Prime Minister came into power in 2014. The urban manifesto of their party had a proposal to build 100 new cities
I
along
remember that.
100 new cities,
Right.
along industrial corridors connecting Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata. Um, we had a draconian land acquisition policy, which was changed by the previous government, which this government tried to dilute but could not attempt to do it. But simultaneously, they also realized that they didn't have enough money to build those cities. I mean, 100 crores.
Yeah, that is a real issue. You know, that is a real
That
issue.
program changed to
Right.
a smart cities program where you give small pots of money to second, third tier cities as well as metropolitan cities, essentially for technology oriented projects or peri-urbanization projects or environment improvement projects, which are very small projects essentially. So that's what has happened, and I'll come to the second city's question, but I didn't finish my first point, and I want to kind of get back to it.
Yes.
And I'm just thinking, like, what kind of languages, and particularly for architects, when we kind of work or kind of think through practices or claims of pay over space, both in living and work, what kind of languages we might develop? How might we, while recognizing dispossession, exclusion, and displacement, how might we try to frame a language to understand practices, spatialities, that also look at efforts towards building space? And the only language until now that architects seem to have is incrementality.
Yes.
That comes to the place. And I think the experience of the pandemic opens out necessities for a more exploratory conceptual vocabulary. I'm thinking in the examples that Mukta kind of, the pictures that Mukta kind of showed, whether mending, stitching, ways of thinking of more gentler ways of languages that have to do with repairing of life, retrofitting of spaces,
right,
can lend itself to design. And particularly, how can that transform the housing question?
You know what is a good example is the Dutch. And if you think of their sort of two big cities, I mean, they have almost no land, you know that, and half of the country is beneath the sea level, and they are on the sea. We know this, right? You know all of this, I assume, or not. And still, they keep building. And, they are extremely entrepreneurial, of course, the Dutch. But I have been impressed with how they do what, say, it seems almost impossible to get done in the United States, which is to build new cities and to make them reasonably functional, not that it isn't some sort of... I don't know what it will take for the leadership of cities to actually engage in these issues that we're raising. And the risk is, certainly in the West, that what happens is that a big, a company takes over because they can make money. But that should not be the logic for building new cities. We can make money, and so it is sort of it's not an easy issue. But I do think that we could be doing much better, certainly in the United States, than we're doing now. I mean, that is no doubt. And I remain intrigued as to why it sounds like a little revolution. Building a new city it is not a revolution. It is an addition. It is something that enables all kinds of actors. We have to change also the language, I think. to get there, to make it more acceptable? But you also mentioned the question of money, of course. It costs a hell of a lot of money. And if a government cannot put in a lot of that money, not all of it, but a lot, it's going to be very difficult to succeed. That's also the issue that we confront a bit in the United States.
I wanted to come in here with some of my work. So I live in a city called Gurgaon, which is sort of at the southern border of the capital Delhi, and it's sort of an example of this new private city sort of phenomenon. Just because you talked about investment and so it's really complex, because it's not that it has to be the government putting in all of the money, but the way that relationship between the private and the government is managed. And I know Rohit has done a lot of work on special economic zones and those kind. So India's had a bunch of experiments in the last decade and a half, couple decades, around public-private partnerships and urbanization. And what it's really taught us is that the government in a place like India, the state cannot recede beyond a point. The more it recedes, it cannot draw back beyond a point. The more it tries to recede, the more important it becomes as a mediator between various actors in the political economy. And it doesn't have the capacities to even do that sometimes. So it all ends up becoming quite a mess. And the lived experience of the people in these new, more privately invested cities is not the best. And of course, there are also other issues relating to the ecological impacts and, whether they've followed environmental regulations. So every private city has got into trouble in one way or the other. And so we're not very confident about either the government supported urbanization programs or we haven't worked out the public-private partnership mode in a way that is really sustainable. So that's
if you were in charge, or any one of you, if you were in charge, what are the first 3 steps? Throw 1, 2, 3, and then we hope that we can launch. What in your country, with your knowledge of your cities, etc., what would be the first 3 critical steps?
Rohit.
Saskia is really, doing her field work on us. Using us as interlocutors. Saskia, I would think that at this moment in India, more than doing something, actually doing something, we do really need conceptual vocabularies to think about our existing urbanization. And I think that's where the question of language that both of you have opened out becomes very important, which is where I was going to come to my next point, which both of you all kind of together opened out also, around small cities. And Saskia, you made a provocation that small cities are places to look forward to in terms of urbanization in the future. And Mukta too kind of pointed out to some of these, like we do have several second and third tier cities, and the state is kind of invested in building infrastructural corridors. And I'm wondering,
is that working out? Is that good or not in your view?
I'm just wondering that, thinking through the idea of language, I'm just wondering whether it might be important and necessary for all of us to think about what does it mean when we use the term the urban corridor. And is it the corridor that links, as the state imagines, to both cities which will transport goods to distant places. Yeah. But if corridors are at stake, then my question I have to think through further for architects and others, and I would love to have your responses on this, is what do we mean by urban corridors when we conceptualize them? What are the softer ways that people access corridors of urbanization, including things like roads, railways, and other kinds of infrastructure, but also technology. And how does that open up a form of a network beyond the ways in which the state imagines these corridors?
Yeah, I mean, that to me sounds, certainly in a complex country like yours, you know, that sounds like a reasonable proposition, I guess. What I sort of object to, is this endless expansion of existing cities, because it is the poor and eventually the modest middle classes that really pay a high price. And there is a kind of injustice built into that. So my little battle now is, as you already heard me say, is to sort of these mid-level cities, building those. The issue is, where does the money come from? You know, I don't know how it is in your country, but in the United States, obstacle number one, where do we get the money if we are building a small city rather than a grand whatever something? And I am sure that we will get there in one way or another, because in a way we must. We must change something. We cannot go on with endless cities, you know, huge cities that go on and on. I just don't think. But it is a challenge. It is I mean, when you look at countries like the Netherlands and Seoul, you know, they have very little land. You have a lot of land, right? And they have succeeded very well. It can be done, but it takes also certain culture, certain options, you know, and I think when you have you have a huge country, right? A huge population. That is a challenge on its own terms. I mean, that is really, the United States is not so huge in terms of the population size, given the size of the land. And so I think it's probably easier to do in the United States than in a country like China. I mean, you really have not a lot of land left over, or do you? Empty land.
No, because there is the question of food production. So no, not really.
Yes, exactly. You're going to be eliminating.
Agricultural land is also severely contested right now, because there is a lot of pushback from the food production. I mean, the concern over food security is also something that a large, very populous country like ours needs to constantly think about. So it's not just the housing question, it's the food question. That's a big question in India.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that. Now, in the case of the United States, we have so much bad food that
we're getting there with the bad food.
Okay, right.
No, so I was just wondering, maybe Mukta, whether you want to kind of respond to the ways of thinking about corridors.
Yes. I'll actually give you an example from my PhD fieldwork of a city called Kishangarh, which is in northern India. It's in Rajasthan, near Ajmer. So Ajmer is a mid-sized city. Was one of the it was a favorite colonial it had got a lot of investment by the British basically, and it's like a railway place, and it's got a religious tourism stuff happening. And there is this city which is built about 70 kilometers, which is about 70 kilometers from there, which is nothing on the map. It has a little fortlet, an old sort of a princely kingdom, which is completely feudal and agrarian in nature. And in the 1930s, a few textile mill kind of investments come in. And then about 20 years ago, it explodes into a stone processing hub. And all of that investment is being made by business elites from the city. Of course. Right? Yeah. So it's typical of how cities grow in India. You know, there's a railway station, there's a little bit of a infrastructure hub. There's one business elite who decides to sort of start off, and then it sort of becomes this thing. And then the state comes in and acquires land and creates industrial land and all of this. Now, the issue is that when I did my field work, you have very large tracts of land that the state has converted into industrial land land, and this hub is really thriving, but the size of the municipality is minuscule. So the footprint of the governance of the state is minuscule. And so the question of who thinks about housing, who thinks about services, so it's not the money that's the problem. That's the point I was coming to. It's not the money that's the problem. The money's there, but the money has a different set of priorities. Who balances the priorities out so that it becomes a sustainable and a livable place is the question that we need to ask ourselves. So in a state like Rajasthan, which is not a very prosperous state and doesn't see itself as a highly urbanized state, it doesn't have the mentality to say that, I recognize these 10 places as places that have potential, and so I'm going to divert some governance capacity to these places and fill in those gaps. And that's the kind of, I think, agile thinking that we need to develop. And I agree with Rohit that for that we need a new language, we need a new conceptualization. But if we don't have that agility, and that agility can only come from within the state, as in the state needs that agility, because the capital already has it. It's recognized the opportunity and it's gone and done whatever it had to do. It's used its political connections to bring in state investment, but then who completes the picture?
Yeah.
So this is where we are really, we need to do a lot more thinking and work around interdisciplinary sort of, connections here. How do we marry governance with agrarian practices even, all of the agrarian land around the city, what happens to it? Does it get swallowed up in an endless expansion of this industry in this very environmentally degraded sort of way? Or do we use the fact that it has a logistics capacity to make agriculture also more productive in those places, so that then, the logistics function of that city can also develop? It's not used only for marble or for stone, which it's originally built for, but also for agriculture. Nobody's thinking about these things in place like that.
Yeah, no, I can see it.
From a small city is a big problem in India.
Yeah,
Everybody's thinking from the big city. And
Yeah.
applying those concepts to smaller places, which doesn't work.
Yeah.
A number of examples can be pointed out. Like
just giving you an example of what's common in India.
Yes.
We'll open up the platform for questions from the audience. We have Chitra Vishwanath, who has a question which is typed in there. I was wondering, Chitra, whether you would like to come in and talk about your question.
Chitra, you're writing more questions. You're being asked to come and join the conversation.
Yeah, please to come in and join the conversation.
Where is she?
Okay, but so the question is, what about smart city initiatives?
What about
smart city initiatives, which specifically meant for tier 2 cities, and what do we think about the 74th Amendment? So Mukta, I'll kind of let you speak first, and Saskia, if you want to join following that.
Yeah, so essentially the example that I was giving of the small, very poor state capacities in these cities is a question of the 74th Amendment. So essentially we have had this constitutional amendment in 1992, which devolves functions to the third tier of government. But in typically key functions around land, key functions around investment, are retained by the second tier, which is at state level. So we don't actually devolve functions to the extent that we should. So I think the faith in municipal governance in India is quite low. The municipalities are thought of as holding together certain services, typically sanitation, solid waste management, and they don't really go much beyond that. They're understaffed. Under-resourced in other ways. The ways to collect, they don't have a lot of avenue to collect revenue, etc. So it's an incomplete devolution. So it has the power. My own personal take is that there is still merit in the idea, but that the state doesn't have enough faith in the third tier of of government. It is considered as a tier that is very given to local sort of corruption, elite capture. I mean, so that's the impression. So there's a fear that the power, if you devolve the power, then things will happen that are not in your control, and cities will become ungovernable entities. But of course, the counter view is that unless you let that experiment run its course, you don't really know. So we're stuck in that space right now. On the smart city question, I think a lot of tier 2 cities have had some success with it. But again, from a governance perspective, hi Chitra, nice to see you finally. Oh, you're here. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think because the smart city has been executed in this sort of project mode.
Yeah.
It really depends on the city and whether it's had the vision to pick a project that is workable, that has local support, that has enough capital, infusion. So it's very scattered story. It's hard to spend money in this country.
Yeah, I think that's a right point. Hard to spend money in this country, even if we have it.
Yeah.
And I think what Saskia says is, I mostly see that there are many cities in our cities, rather than we making more cities. Already they're all, in fact, we have mix of cities and villages within our cities. And that's how our cities survive. They don't really work as a cohesive one city. I come from Bangalore, and many times we just don't know what happens in South Bangalore if you're in North Bangalore. In fact, once when we protested, there was this whole difference. People started saying they didn't talk about a city, they talked about North and South Bangalore, that they don't understand each other. So thank you very much. Yeah, I managed to get myself through. Thank
I
you.
would love to hear other opinions from, I see Susharaka, Nima Vishavanatha. I'm just reading the names, but I would love to hear, because you are such a huge, complex, highly variable country that I don't know if you're all actually living in the same city. That would be a disappointment. But if you're not, I would like to hear from other cities, like Tushara.
Shara, you want to come in?
And what city is
You're
Tushara?
on mute, Tushara. You'll have to unmute yourself.
You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm from Calicut, which is in Kerala, south of India. So I'm actually, I don't know whether we can, this is a city where a lot of this started this historic trajectory with this transoceanic history and all those things. And it's like, it has got a cosmopolitan expression. And I don't know, how I can relate to the discussion here, because, could you come again with the question? That's okay.
What did she ask?
You asked whether you can frame the question for her again, because she didn't.
Oh, okay. So you heard the description of your colleague, right? Of Mukta Naik. So in terms of where you are, your city, I don't know if you're in the same city. If you're in the same city, the question changes, but it's the same issue. What is your experience? What are the positives? What are the negatives? But I just wanted to hear from a few, again, because you're such a big country, like Mukta Naik was very explicit in describing a certain set of elements. And maybe some of you, I don't mean disagree, but have a totally different experience in your country. Maybe there are some cities where stuff is really happening, partly because they're smaller cities. Cities are live animals. They keep changing, they keep adding, and they keep destroying, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I will have to actually exit rather soon, because I have a car picking me up, and I cannot afford to lose that car.
No worries, Saskia. So
Very good.
Yes, if you want to kind of come in, and then we'll follow with some.
I think the similar, I mean, I may have a similar experience in many friend like Dr. Mukta was mentioning, because I mean, in probably in the kind of a geography, that it shares, where Mukta was mentioning about her city and Calicut. But I think these questions are so provocative, and I'll still have to think through for comparing.
Okay, you think through and I'll connect with you next year.
Sure, thank you.
Actually, the truth of the matter is that I have a car, my husband just told me, a car waiting for me to take me to London. So I'm going to have to say goodbye. It was wonderful. I learned a lot. You have such a big, complicated country. One can never learn fully what your country is about. It's really an impressive country. So it was a pleasure, and I wish you the best.
Thank you, Saskia. It was a pleasure to have you.
Bye.
And we look forward to more conversations with you, even on email. So there are a lot of things that you post which are interesting to kind of get in conversation with you. So thank you very much.
Okay. Kisses to all of you, and I say goodbye. I have to now close my computer. You know how that goes.
Yeah, goodbye, big hug.
Bye, Saskia. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
So yeah, I mean, Saumini, would you like to come in and kind of, pose your thoughts, and we'll kind of find a way of taking this conversation further with Mukta as well as others who are over here.
Thank you, Rohit. It's very interesting, Mukta, your insights, both Mukta and Chitra, because in Kerala, if you see the 73rd and 74th Constitution Amendment, the devolution of governance was implemented way before, I think, most of the other parts of the country came into being. And it will be interesting to see, Mukta, how in a small town of Kerala, compared to the Kishangarh case that you have mentioned, how does this devolution of governance sort of affect the way the cities grow? So when I say growth, I don't necessarily mean by the physical infrastructure of a city, but more from the social infrastructure of a city. Because if you look at the municipal budgets, you generally see in Kerala that there's quite an allocation for the social infrastructure to be built. So that's one that one might have to look at the differentials here across the country, where there's a very, very specific case of Kerala and its small towns vis-a-vis Kishangarh or other cities in, let's say, Rajasthan or any other state in India. The second part is where Chitra sort of very interestingly put this idea of cities within a city, or rather villages within a city. And my experience on that, I just wanted to share my experience here is one where I spent some time in Ahmedabad, where one would get to see animals which otherwise you see in a landscape, which is a rural landscape of India, walking the streets. And you will actually see these formations, very close resemblance to gamtals within cities. And you have very interesting names as well for these gams which are located within the city. Now that landscape vis-a-vis what we have in Kerala, I'm taking a very specific case of Trivandrum, although the sizes are not comparable, but we still see these village kind of, a mosaic of villages within Trivandrum as well. Although in its formal nature, in its formal quality, it may not resemble anything of these gams or gamtals that you see in the north of India. But the way communities form, the way communities connect with themselves, the way they form small settlements within the city's larger landscape, and how these communities sort of interact with one another and contribute in a way to the city building. So I really like this way Chitra sort of painted this idea of an Indian city with these, villages within the city. It's very, very interesting. And I think this is one pattern that one can see here. And it's very unfortunate that something like smart cities is being used as projects to sort of build cities through technological interventions from a very techno-managerial framework, which is very, very disturbing. And I have this experience of working on a particular project, like what you said, Mukta, of these highways that sort of connect major Indian cities. But I'm talking about specific case of Trivandrum, where there is a proposal of a ring road which cuts through the rural pockets of peri-urban Trivandrum. But when we were working on this, there was a very interesting insight from the government itself, saying that the image of the land that gets opened up through this development should resemble something like Gurgaon. So I'm just placing these three instances here, Rohit. I don't know whether I'm making any sense, but
you are, and I was wondering whether you wanted Mukta to respond to this, or
it's an open thing. I was just taking these examples as a reflection of the speakers.
Mukta, would you like to come in, or yeah?
No, I'm happy for anybody else to respond to. I mean, they're great provocations. I think Chitra is saying something.
Yeah, I mean, let me come in over here. I mean, it seems to be waiting. Maybe she'll respond later. I personally think, Chitra, your points, many of the things that you all are saying are very important, but conceptually, I think we need to move away from the language of the city and the village, because it is a lot more loaded than what it conveys. And this language, which is a product of late 19th century thinking, the opposition of the city or the town to the village, or the city to the country, which kinds of comes to us in the framing of the town and country planning organization, also is embedded in very architectural ways of thinking, like that of Ebenezer Howard's, translates in the late 20th century into the idea of the peri-urban. And the peri-urban then becomes a place, the periphery, the place which is both inside and outside the city, which has both city and village-like conditions. But what is a city and what is a village, given the present moment and times that we are living in? Definitions, even census-based definitions that vary across countries, have been challenged. But I think it is also important to go beyond thinking about census-level definitions to ask an ontological question here of what is a city over here. And we do definitely need to move beyond these 20th century conceptualizations of the city and village, or cities within cities. I think that the provocation that both Saskia and Mukta made on thinking through language, I think that is a central question for the discipline of architecture to take up. And language, and when I use the word language, I mean it in a very broad sense, not only textual language or spoken language, but also the drawn language in that sense, like all of them coming together. I think these inquiries into space and urbanization are going to be very, very important into reconceptualizing our cities. I think it's very important to move away from our older languages. Yeah. And I think that's a question that ought to be taken up within the discipline of architecture. It's already been taken up within the discipline of geography and urban studies. Say, for instance, if you look at the work of Neil Brenner, who poses a question to such a framing of what is urban, and the idea of an urban age. I'm like posing a very sharp question to the whole London School of Economics project around that we are now in the urban age. He poses, where does that idea of or conceptualization of urban come from? What does it exactly mean? Are we really in an urban age now?
Can I come in here?
Yeah.
I think also these ideas like the urban age, or these ideas like the metropolis, or the idea of building a Gurgaon-like city outside of Trivandrum, are because we have accepted sort of capitalistic modes of, I mean, there's an idea of this is to reproduce the city as a money-making device. So the people are not really the consideration here. And this sort of, it always leads me to think about scale. Coming back to your question of neighborhoods within the city, villages within the city, communities within the city. And as architects, I mean, one part is, of course, architectural practice is a completely different consideration. And that opens out a whole new set of questions about, I mean, if you think from the small city, there is no architect. I mean, there is no architect in the small city, not the way we think of an architect, with certain ideas and a certain vocabulary and a certain sensibility of design. That's a very different animal, the architect who practices in a small city, right? So leaving questions of practice aside, at what scale does architecture locate itself? Can it locate itself at the urban scale, or does it only sort of serve its function at a very neighborhood scale? Because the kind of decisions that go into city making at an urban scale are so far away from the zone of influence of an architect, or even the planner for that matter. And sort of these sort of questions of, I mean, I'm more planner than architect, and in Delhi, we've been sort of engaged with this draft master plan that Delhi is coming up with. And it's been 3 years of getting communities engaged with the plan. And it's striking that the communities who want to input in the plan cannot think beyond either their scalar neighborhood or their community of practice. Meaning, if I'm a street vendor, I think about street vendors and vending spaces. And so the scalar imagination of the citizen is at a particular scale, and the scalar imagination of the bureaucratic, technocratic planner has no notion of that scale. So we are at an impasse here, where the technocratic planning system is trying to produce an urban machine which is in the service of a particular kind of financialized idea of city making. And what people want from the city is a better life, a way to be able to practice livelihoods, a way to be able to build incrementally, get a toilet where you don't have toilets. So this everyday scale and this large hyper scale, and there's nothing in between really. So for me, I mean, it's a question of where do we want to embed this in terms of scale and spatiality, this whole conversation, because, they have to be apples and apples that we are comparing. Oftentimes in our conversations, even if we're thinking through language or through category, we are not really, it's apples to oranges, and we don't really get anywhere. So that's sort of been my frustration with this whole thing.
Thanks, Mukta, thanks. But I have a slight difference over there, and I don't think it is a question of scale. And because when we consider inquiry into architecture as a discipline, and I'm kind of reminded over here of Christian Schmidt's work from ETH Zurich. I mean, he's a sociologist who teaches in the architecture department in ETH. And in working with this whole way of moving away from current conceptualizations of tiering of cities, first tier, second tier, third tier, he's looking at the geography of Switzerland, which in the context of Europe has been understood as more rural than urban. Switzerland as a country. And his inquiries try to open out ways in which we can think about Switzerland's urbanization beyond hierarchies or numberings in terms of tiers, or between as either cities and villages. And what might that inquiry be in terms of framing a language? I think with Kerala becomes an excellent example to explore similar kinds of questions in the Indian context in a very different way. But there's a kind of a referent over here for us to kind of push through the questions that Mukta and Saskia posed. Brinda has a question over here, and Brinda, would you like to talk a little bit about it? And
yeah, thank you. I will not be able to turn on my camera, but just had a thought on the fact that when we were talking about the architecture scale and looking at it in the context of a city or a region, wouldn't we be better off thinking of, especially I'm bringing it back to the conversation on displacement and migration, and then relating to it from the perspective that the temporariness and the transition that one had experienced in those, in that exodus and in that time period is something that we should probably be dwelling on in considering what could be the possible form it might take, because these are processes and those processes may help us derive some sort of a framework that would bring about a formal output. And it would also probably, I kind of in continuation said, something that would build a continuum between the rural and the urban, because those are those spaces probably, if you spatialize it, where these kinds of interventions can happen in a physicality, in the form of a physicality. So that was my thought. And I was just wondering what, if there was a response to that.
Yeah. Mukta, would you like to elaborate? I think you'd already have typed it, but if you...
Well, no, I mean, I think the continuum already exists in practice. It's just that it's not recognized as such by the categories that we use to measure, define, and speak about these things. So I'll give you an example from the Delhi context. Delhi is sort of less dense on its northwestern side. The south and the east side is super dense. So there's all this land which is not particularly well utilized, and the Delhi Development Authority has been trying to push development in this through this land pooling sort of a stuff, and this land pooling is obviously picked up from other models like Gujarat and where things where it's been done before, but there aren't enough takers for it. And when you drive through that whole area, you see the rural-urban continuum. You see how spaces are in these liminal kind of, liminal existence, and how they are leveraging their rurality and urbanity and that in-betweenness in different ways. And not really buying into this city, this idea of the metropolis and of land valorization that the city is trying to impose on it. So I think that's already the reality of India, but we are not recognizing it, and in not recognizing it, we are creating problems for ourselves. However, how do we recognize it, and how does this get into the lexicon of our governance and our practice? And that's coming back to the language question. We know that there are urban villages in cities where lived realities may be partially urban and partially rural, but does the category of the urban village actually serve these communities? Who is the category serving?
Right.
I mean, these are also political questions, because, when the master plan draft came out, all these villages in this land pooling zone are turning around and asking this question: who is this policy benefiting? Is it benefiting us who've lived here for generations, or is it going to benefit the DLFs who's going to come in and going to be able to take away our land? So all of these things are turning into, I think, questions of contestation, and the space for having debates about these contestations is not really there in our public sphere and our governance paradigms. And so we get stuck with these categories for very long times, even though the realities change. That's my own sort of take on this.
Thanks, Mukta. Are there any further questions? And we'll kind of take one or two if there are questions. Okay, they don't seem. Yeah, Arul.
Hi, my name is Arul. Of course, I just have of course, listening to all the conversations, I have one quick question. Like you said, I believe there is a visualization problem of all the issues. Every class or sector or section of the society, or each section have their own issues, and they can only visualize the problem or visualize even a bill or a policy. Of course, they can't even visualize a policy that is being passed. So, of course, there are. I mean, at every level there is a problem. How does, as an age or as an institution or as an architect, how do we contribute to the visualization process? I believe there is this. The issue is the visualization, I believe, but of course, all these conversations that happen at the academic level, but how can this be taken to the mass? You know, what should be devised so that this thinking of or visualization of a policy or development, and basically I'm not able to really frame it well, but I think there is an issue of visualization. So you as an expert, should there be some kind of thinking or thought process to kind of take these conversations to the masses, is my question.
Thanks, Arul.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think the conversations are already being taken to the masses. It's just that certain policies and certain conversations are more urgent or capture the imagination of a larger number of people than others. I agree with you that many of the policy conversations are very obtuse, are very difficult for even people in the policy space, leave alone the ordinary citizen. I think, and there's a role for intermediaries, there is a role for people. And, I've been seeing through my career a lot of people, Rohit included, who play those intermediary roles in navigating conversations which are top down, which are imagined in a top down sort of a paradigm, and translating them or using those concepts and engaging at community level. It's happening. It's just that it's not an organized setup, and I mean there has to be an engaged a set of engaged citizens in a place that can do that. And I think that's where you see the differences between different parts of our country, where in a place like Kerala, where decentralization is definitely a little bit more those conversations are probably easier to take to a lower level, and in other places it's almost impossible, because the burden on that intermediary would be just too high to translate it and take it down, because those institutions don't exist. You have to create them. There are parts of the country that we've worked in where there is not a single NGO in operation, literally, and you're like, how do you do field work here? How do you find out anything about the place without an intermediary at all? So
Right.
so it's very that density of civil society is also very variable across the country, which I find very interesting. What is it about certain places that engenders so much conversation, and other places which is like there's nothing? But definitely I think that's a very fertile space, especially in India. And then there are also complications of how co-opted the intermediaries become by the state discourse itself, and sort of more complicated kind of questions like that, which will plague that process. But you do need to start the conversation.
Right.
And it's possible for architects to do that. and do it successfully because you have the power to visualize something.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mukta. And I mean, the question of architectural practices, doing this, one sees that many architectural practices are moving away from the older form of practice, which was based around only patron-generated projects. And a lot of them are exploring newer kinds of spaces to generate these projects. And that's where the question of visualization also becomes very useful. So thanks a lot, Mukta. Is there anybody else who would like to pose a point, frame a question, offer a comment? Anybody wants to address Mukta's question? Maybe Saumini, Meenakshi.
Mukta, yes, absolutely. It's very interesting that a lot of practices today sort of engage in at one point one would call it alternate practice, right? That has become mainstream in a way. So, for example, and it's also interesting that I must mention this at this juncture, that the curatorial talks that one sees as part of Seeds initiative in Mumbai, and also Seeds initiative in Mumbai, and Seeds initiative in Kerala. There are a lot of practices that get a venue to sort of explore what once we thought as alternate. So, from my own experience, there have been situations where one would sort of understand there is a need for a project here. Let's say, for example, the water edges of Trivandrum, which one comes across as needing a kind of a relook at the idea of a backyard, and sort of looking at what used to be a front yard and what has turned into a backyard, and now how do you bring that back into a front yard, and what does it mean to communities who are living there. So these are not really the projects, or these are not really discussed in the mainstream architectural practice, but it is explored by certain groups who identify this issue, who become agents to take it up with the local government, take it up with the local communities, and become the voice for the communities to sort of start seeing a change in the city and its components. So there are definitely many practices, and it's interesting that only I think yesterday that Seed sort of concluded with a very interesting set of talks on this, and also I think it was last semester, Rohit, that you had it's an ongoing series of curated lectures. You're also looking at this. So yes, absolutely, there is a change that one can see, or probably I wouldn't say change that one could see. I would say a change that was made consciously visible. Probably this existed, but we did not really speak about it. We never had venues for such practices to sort of come and showcase themselves. So yeah, that's my answer to it. I could share some of these examples with you if you are interested. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, that would be really useful.
Chitra, would you like to elaborate on that point?
Yeah. So it's basically, it's usually quite a bit. It's a personal interest too. So, like for us in biome, it's been with water and sewerage. Okay, so and it cannot happen by just being only architects. You need various other people. You need volunteers too, and various other professions coming together to understand and do it.
Yeah.
It's very important that we get out of the silo of being just architecture practices and become something more, and then we can engage with the city better.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this is very important, like how do you move away from the object nature of architectural practice, which also connects to the point that Saumini was making. I mean, what seems to be happening to me is that there are forums that are curating platforms for these practices to present their thoughts. I don't know whether there is a very concerted effort in terms of researching and writing about such practices. Right? And that would be very interesting to take up, because that opens out several other questions for the discipline of architecture, in the sense that if the nature of practice changes, what kind of frames of theory does it open up? And that's a very important kind of, again, a question of language that kind of opens out over here. Sense. So if you move away from kind of designing the making of buildings to rather thinking about the built environment in a broader way, where there may be practice of communicative and collaborative action, what kind of theories and knowledges might be useful for architects in terms of thinking about practice? So yeah, that's a question that seems to.
And sitting inside an institution that has very few architects and lots of social scientists, also vice versa. I think in a lot of circumstances, people are not able to imagine what the role of an architect or a design practitioner could be, because they simply haven't been in those spaces for a long enough time, or there are not enough architects engaging in those spaces. So it's really interesting when you have architectural training and you enter an activist space, people will literally pounce on you and say, you're an architect, do this. But a lot of people are like, what can she do? She's an architect. There's no space for architecture, here. So these sort of, it's also in taking Chitra's comment forward, not just in the architectural practice, but also what other forms of practice think about architecture. Is shifting or needs to shift if we are to remain relevant and sort of be successful in engaging with the relevant struggles of our times.
Yeah, but I really like the way Rohit puts it, that you require now a theory, frames of theory, and moving away from just the making of buildings and that whole aspect of language, Rohit. It's fascinating. How do you teach now? Yeah, in this changing world. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been extremely great being in this session.
Yeah, and on that note, thank you, Chitra, and thank you, everybody, for participating in this conversation. Thanks, Mukta, for your provocations and your responses to even Saskia's provocations. It was lovely to kind of get those provocations from you. There was really quick thinking, I think. Thank you, Saumini, Meenakshi, and your colleagues at Avani for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation here, and I look forward to being in conversation. So with that, I'll hand over to Tushara, who will offer our vote of thanks. Thanks.
Thank you, Rohit. So that actually marks the final session of the Avani Annual Research Symposium 2021. So thank you everyone for joining in and for your wonderful participation. It has been 2 days of intense discussions and deliberations through the question on what is normal. And it's a great pleasure to see how over these 2 days, the symposium became a platform for critical discourses with young researchers and the experienced keynote speakers who are academicians as well as professional practitioners from all around the world, sharing their deep insights, unique visions, approaches, and collaborative processes. We hope it really expands the horizons of our thoughts and actions in examining the ecologies of adaptation as design ontologies in sustaining human lives as we move forward. We could see this setting a tone for this long journey, which has just started with this event. On behalf of the Symposium advisor, Architect Vijay Ramachandran, co-conveners Dr. Saumini, Meenakshi, Sebastian, I would like to extend a deep gratitude to everyone for making this event possible. We would like to take this opportunity to thank all our keynote speakers, Professor Chaya, Architect Samir Besrai, Dr. Deepta Satish, Dr. Himanshu Butte, Architect Rohan Shivkumar, Architect Shubhra Raje, Professor Sarosh Shanklisaria, Dr. Janvi Falke, Dr. Saskia Sassen, Architect Mukta Naik, and to all the wonderful moderators, including Architect Rajshekhar Meron, Architect Kiran Kumar, and Architect Rohit Majumdar. A big thank you to all the paper presenters for their critical contributions and the intense interactions. Thank you Nusrat Taslim and Mohammad Nisar for the contributions to the symposium graphics, and to our dear colleagues Aditya, Kevin, for their timely interventions with Avani graphics. We extend our token of appreciation to our faculty colleagues, Nitin, Vineet, Varun, Satyajit, Ujjayant, and Anjali for the day curations and for extending the technical support. And thank you, Nima and Jilna, for your coordination at the student front. Thanks to the governing council members for extending their wholehearted support in this event. Sincere gratitude to faculty colleagues, the admin team, and to our dear students for their helping hands in making this happen. Moving forward, we hope to continue these critical conversations into our pedagogical practices at Avani, thereby adding to the collective scholarships that are not restricted to, but built through linking of these 6 domains, themes, provocations of the symposium. Thank you everyone once again. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Well done, Avani.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye. Thanks, Mukta. Thanks, Rohit. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.